right, everyone. Welcome to this next installment of Grab the Reins. My name is Eric Wahlberg, and thank you for joining us. We're joined today by Charlie Borrowman Smith. Charlie is building a lot of interesting projects that I'm sure we'll get into in the crypto space, alongside being a contributor to Palladium, which is actually how I was, kind of introduced to your thinking and thoughts. And once I read that, and once again, just to say, it's a tour de force, man. Really, I enjoyed it. I really appreciated it. So I always, Charlie, like give people the opportunity to expand on the introduction that I give them. So if you want to just tell us what you think maybe for the conversation, the relevant parts of the story of Charlie.
Sure. Yeah. So I think I kind of have sort of dual passions, both in kind of philosophy, history, writing. I've been just recently contributed to Palladium, contributed to the Economist magazine in the past, and kind of penned a few essays here and there.
Mhm.
And then on the other side, I've also been really interested in trying to build ventures in the crypto space, and I've been doing that for the past few years. So kind of splitting my time between the two. And yeah, and then outside of that, I'm British American, grew up in New England, was born in London, and yeah, I mean, I think that's it.
Yeah, amazing. First of all, I should also say, pretty exciting that this is the first. We were just talking about this in-person installment of this. For a lot of people who've been doing like these podcasts or conversations, doing it over the digital, in the digital sphere, is so much less rewarding than doing it in the analog world. So I'm really excited just about like that singular fact. I think we'll have an awesome conversation as a result. So, okay, so I think the kind of the place to start, Charlie, is with your article in Palladium, because I think it just has so much in there that we can kind of dig into. So I think maybe the first thing to kind of do is ask you to kind of introduce the article, and if you want to start even like a bit, kind of the maybe a story, if there is one, that led you to that creating that article and kind of that journey of thought, and then obviously an introduction into post-humanism, and just a broad overview of the article in general, and then we'll dive into kind of some of the nitty-gritty details.
Sure. So yeah, the article is confronting modernity means overcoming humanism. And the intention of the article really was just to try to point a path forward out of a lot of intellectual confusion that I think there is, and that spans everything from social sciences to the way we talk about politics and the way in general that we kind of talk about the modern condition. I basically felt as though a lot of the thinking that feels most confused is that which assigns a bunch of sort of intentionality and control to modern phenomena, when really a lot of these things are out of our control. And so kind of over time, I just found myself being drawn to thinkers who look at modernity and don't sort of assign a lot of like intentionality, who don't look at it and think this is something that we fully understand. I've been drawn more and more to thinkers who kind of view modernity as an extension of nature,
Right.
to see modern society as this like highly complex phenomena that's sort of increasingly drifting outside of our comprehension and control. And what made me want to write the piece ultimately was that I had this sort of intellectual hunch, which was, okay, I think, a lot of like kind of modern political thinking serves as a sort of like cope ideology that's kind of trying to assign comprehensibility to something that's really confusing. But then I also felt as though that like hunch was mirrored in like a very gut level sense that a lot of us have, which is that, there's a lot of like narratives in the media. There's a lot of people with big ideas trying to persuade us of things. But in reality, like, it seems as though the direction society's going in is something that we don't really have like a handle on. That like fundamentally what it is to be, alive today is to be in a kind of historical condition where it feels as though no one's at the wheel, really.
Yeah.
And so the essay was an attempt to sort of say, not to despair and say, no one's at the wheel, society's sort of chaotic and uncontrollable, but instead to say, how can you wrangle with that condition? What it's best not to ignore that fact, but how can you revisit the modern condition and find a way to thrive in it, that doesn't presume that we have like this sort of grand top-down control. And I can get much more into that, but that's the basic impetus for it.
That's fantastic. And I think one of the things that I was struck by reading the piece, and I told you this on like the pre-call we had, was this profound sense of humility, like just in the actual like idea of post-humanism. And what I find interesting is, and you cite some of the thinkers, Nassim Taleb, and Nick Land.
Mhm.
And they're often, particularly Nassim, I mean, and maybe he kind of brings
Right.
it upon himself, but they're often really considered to be very brash, and people really focus on kind of them as individuals as opposed to kind of, kind of appreciating the tremendous humility that is inherent in their, political philosophies and their ideas along with yourself. And I never considered the kind of built-in hubris of humanism, concepts of modernity, and I also think there's examples of schools of thought that think about modernity as a natural process, but seem to lack that humility. So I personally think, and it's not a slight at him, just kind of an observation, but Kevin Kelly's Technium, there seems to me to be this like really self-assuredness that like it's all going to be okay, because it's like this, it's this process that's been going on since the Big Bang, and so just you are a process, not an endpoint, and just be a process, like relax. What's different, I find, in kind of the post-humanism that you suggest is, this could be, kind of inherently like this could not go well. And how do we create structures, and how do we lean on, certain institutions, that could help us, navigate this, and kind of mitigate some of the worst risks that exist in a complex, modern, highly emergent, process of modernity.
Right, right. Yeah, I definitely tried to come to the piece with a strong sense of, not having all the answers, because I think like the past, 10 or even 20 years has been this period where we've been confronted by event after event that's really bewildering,
Yeah.
and that no one saw coming. It's like you had sort of you had, financial crisis before that, the war on terror, and now COVID, etc. And there's just been kind of event after event that should kind of make us think, okay, we don't have all the answers. Maybe the frames with which we're trying to understand and wrangle with the world don't work. And there seems to be this natural reaction by, many, especially those who have power and have to sort of legitimate it, to triple down on existing orthodoxies.
Yeah.
And to me, like, I think there's at least a role for humility. And so I think, like, despite some of the kind of like pretty swaggering like personas that some of the thinkers have that I've mentioned, I think the commonality between them all, so that's like Nassim Taleb, who's sort of this philosopher of chaos and uncertainty, Nick Land, who sort of has this very decentering, sort of alien view of modernity as a process that's largely outside of our control. I also mentioned John Gray, who's like a great kind of leveler of modernist pretensions, who sort of thinks that we're constantly trapped by ideology and large narratives when we really should be seeing the world more clearly. Alistair MacIntyre, who's a sort of leading Catholic intellectual who thinks that secular thinking has a huge amount of built-in sort of hubris, and that we should be kind of returning to a more modest and like kind of Catholic orientation in how we look at ethics and politics. But through all of them, there's a humility. And I think it's like, to me, I'm just so much more drawn today to thinkers that, where there's some inborn humility, because no one has been able to predict anything that's happened. And I really think that we have reason to expect that we're going to confront many more events that are totally unpredictable and really novel. And there'll be people who will say they have all the answers, but I'm much more interested in people who are, real and genuine about the fact that we're confronting totally alien circumstances. Like these, it's all completely new.
Yeah, I think about, so I kind of find that, particularly you think about the last 20 years, I think that's kind of correct. I would actually extend that. I would say, 1991. I think, even though, Fukuyama gets really misconstrued about what he was saying, but if we kind of categorize a group of politicians globally, like a global class of politicians, maybe you can use the Davos class or something like that, of the kind of end of history politicians who basically have stated, right, like everything's okay, like this is like, we're up and to the right, in terms of, democracy and capital markets and all these different things, literacy rates, all these things, some of which are absolutely kind of true, right? Like you can't, like no one's disputing that, global literacy has improved in, the last 30 years or something like that. But from a mimetic perspective, right, what they've done is they've pushed a product of kind of don't worry, and thus like the vast majority of the population have outsourced their sense making to that class of people. You have this group of people who are kind of saying something that's kind of not as reassuring also forces responsibility back onto the individual in many ways, and kind of the allergic reaction on both from that class of global that global class and the individual is kind of to view these people as name your use your kind of belittling and kind of delegitimizing phrase alt-right or hubristic. They'll go and focus on their personal maybe defects or challenges to kind of avoid the fact that what they're saying to them, right, is like, we do not know what's going on. We are not in control. The best thing you can do to navigate that is for you to kind of lean on your five senses, your view of the world, like where you sit, right? Utilize some of those kind of, to use like a term that's used in a popular sense, like Lindy, right? Like there's a Lindy effect, which Nassim, coined, which is like, so what are the things and institutions, and this is something that I do want to talk to you about, like that you should lean on, like the nuclear family, or the church, or like some religious institution or some community institution, and do that. And why do you think people have that allergic reaction? Like why, because people feel very powerless right now, and have, I think, for quite some time. And it's changed over time, right? I think during the Obama years, people who have a political affiliation on the right felt very disenfranchised. Certainly in the last 4 years, people on the left side, on the left, have felt disempowered. So they feel powerless, but they also don't want to take back power in some sense for themselves. What do you think that is about?
Yeah, I think there's one very large brute fact that is extremely hard to wrangle with, and that's kind of barely acknowledged at this point, which is that as society becomes more and more complex, it becomes more and more unpredictable. It becomes harder to represent and to model. And despite that, we've become increasingly confident about our ability to model. And a lot of our political institutions and our leaders, their legitimacy comes from the sense that they know what's going on. That's really all there is. There isn't like any other deeper legitimacy. There isn't, they don't have, it's not necessarily that they have like great virtues, or that there's some sort of like lineage they're a part of that gives them the right to rule, but it's instead that, that they can model things, that they know what's going on, that, think tanks are just kind of filled with economists and social scientists who provide policymakers with plans, and the kind of reason, the kind of like thin, veneer of legitimacy that there is for, I think, like our kind of governing elite today, that's really coming into question pretty frequently, is that they have a good sense of what's going on. But there's this underlying brute fact that we should expect to be more and more bewildered by what's happening, because society's growing more and more complex. And that's kind of one thinker I reference in the piece is Paul Valery, who points this out, that basically like there's this terrible brute fact that society's complexity is kind of moving kind of exponentially, but our ability to represent and conceptualize complexity is sort of either linear, it's increasing linearly, or it's completely stagnant. You could even argue it's declining, but there's no way it's keeping up with that.
Right.
And so I think, there's a lot of anxiety there, because you're stepping out of like a very known and managed world into something that's much more chaotic and uncomfortable, and the stakes are very high. And I think the thinkers that are going to be the most interesting and the most generative are all across the political spectrum, but they all reckon with this fact. So you can be like a sort of left-wing socialist that recognizes this. And one thinker I've mentioned in the piece is Zygmunt Bauman, who's a Polish sociologist and philosopher. And he was really ahead of the game in recognizing this, where he started to kind of have this narrative, like this sort of understanding of modernity and of capitalism as being a force that fundamentally kind of just liquefies relations. It takes things that are concrete, like a kind of tightly knit village, or even kind of like a deposit of ore or whatever, of iron, that would be kind of these concrete phenomena, and it sort of liquefies things down. And that over time we should expect to be in this sort of more oceanic circumstance where things don't really cohere, things have been splintered down. And so it's this sort of like larger narrative that he has, that's like a really uncomfortable reality, but if you don't reckon with it, you're going to be in trouble. And so and then Land, who's more of this sort of like nihilist kind of right-wing thinker,
right,
that he has a similar take and reacts quite differently. And then Taleb, I think, is harder to like situate on the political spectrum, but he's very much responding to that reality. Alasdair MacIntyre is in the same boat where he sees modernity as a process that isn't like purely progressive, like things just improving, but it's chaotic and it's actually tearing up a lot of social fabric that allows us to relate to each other and to make coherent political decisions. And so I think like that's the thing I'm drawn to, and that's the thing that is the uncomfortable reality that people are sort of rejecting, is just that modern society is becoming incredibly complex and unpredictable, and our main elite, their legitimacy rests on their ability to make sense of it, but it may be that no one can make sense of it.
So yeah, I find that very interesting. And you focus on, like, or at least thus far, we've talked a lot about politicians and things in the sphere of politics. I'm very much of a, and I'm very interested in exploring this through the podcast. One of the things that I've kind of instigated this is the idea that perhaps the United States is undergoing a transition from a nation state to what's called a civilizational state. Examples of civilizational states are China and India. We say the West broadly, but I think what we've experienced certainly in the last 4 years is a massive schism. And if you have people, on the other side of the pond, it's less over the Anglosphere, so like more continental Europe, where we become increasingly unintelligible to each other. And so we're shifting from, and what's different about a nation state versus a civilizational state is a nation state is a state built around politics, as opposed to a civilizational state built around culture. So I wonder if we could, shifting the conversation from, political thinkers to kind of cultural figures who also, kind of also help kind of shape certain social fabric creation, perhaps. So like when I think about this, if I think about what a humanist cultural figure or phenomenon would be, it's like when Gal Gadot was singing, I think it was like Imagine or something like that at the beginning of the pandemic, to try to, and right, all those celebrities in their Bel Air mansions, and it just fell on. It was just so tone deaf, right, and so rejected. So something that would have, in the Obama years, probably been welcomed, right, like in some kind of way. And I was, one of my favorite articles of 2020 was Jacob Siegel's piece called about Joe Rogan being the Aleph, and basically claiming, right, what's interesting about Joe Rogan, right, is like he is not claiming to know or understand everything. He's a very curiosity-driven person, and so tracking his rise. I wonder if Joe Rogan, what do you think about the idea of Joe Rogan as kind of a post-human cultural figure? And I don't know if we could kind of put our fingers on others, but I find that very interesting. That's kind of makes a lot of sense to me.
Right. Yeah. So in the piece, I use the word humanism to refer to the sort of like deification of human agency. So I use it to describe the belief that the modernizing process is something that we're in the driver's seat of, right. That the kind of like modern political institutions and technologies and systems we've developed are things that we sort of intentionally set about to do, and that modernity is something humans are responsible for. And then the kind of post-humanist frame is the take that no, these processes are like crazy and emergent, and to assign human agency to them is like to really distort what they are. And to like the kind of like, whether that's like so if you take someone like Joe Rogan, I think he is someone who doesn't presume to know what's going on, and I think that is what people are drawn to in large part. That you don't come there for easy answers, you come there for kind of discussion. And I do think it's telling too that it resonates just across the board, and that the only group that really seems to have like a consistent problem with him is kind of like people who have a vested interest in saying they have the answers. It's like a sort of like more hyper educated elite that sort of sees him questioning orthodoxies, or like bringing on people who are outside of like the mainstream, and there's sort of like a gut level reaction against him because he's like entertaining conversations which are meant to be closed.
Right.
And and so I think I would say he's definitely I think on a gut level shares that sort of post-humanist position, I'd guess.
Yeah. And it's also interesting, I mean, if you think about some of the mainstream kind of mega hit shows have a lot of kind of gray areas, like characters that like something I like to do is I listen to or watch television from like the 1940s and 50s.
Yeah.
Um, and where there's just pure like black and white, no pun on like actual fact that they're in black and white, just that like things are much more clear cut. You know who the villain is. With the very distinct and interesting exception of the Twilight Zone, which was very avant garde of its time, right? But like that you have very clear definitions. When you're watching a series who the good people, good guys are, who the bad people are. And then today, you kind of have, I don't know, the characters of Westeros and Game of Thrones, or so on. There's just a lot more kind of gray area, and just the fact that these are the things that are being both funded, and these are the things that are being well received. It's kind of also one of these interesting things of the populace really understands, I think, this at a gut level, right? That like we're not in control. Like you have to really do a lot of lying to yourself, right? If you think that like the people that you once trusted like understand what's going on,
right?
And so people also want to experience and listen to stories where it's much more gray, almost as if like they want to inhabit those those stories,
right?
And I just I'm just once again interested in your frame, how it pertains to the cultural production maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, and what a civilization built around a culture of that, what that looks like. It seems to me far more anti-fragile to use, to seem to live, and just far more robust and honest also.
Right. Yeah, I think you mentioned some of these sort of like there's for a long time there's been these sort of more like kind of black and white cultural narratives, stories with like a kind of clear like moral and whatnot. I think even you can go back pretty far, and people and a lot of like kind of art and film has been trying to negotiate like cultural changes, kind of bewildering cultural changes, and sort of make them intelligible to people. Like even I remember over Christmas I was watching a movie, Christmas in Connecticut, which is an old black and white film from, I think it's from the late 40s, and it's about basically like a woman that's like a modern woman who writes for a cultural magazine, and she kind of like portrays this sort of like old school like kind of homemaker. She is like meant to have like a farm, and she like is like cooking for her husband and whatnot, has a kid, and she writes this column like as this persona, but in reality she's like a modern career woman, and she's forced to she basically gets put in this awkward position where she has to host this veteran who's come home from the war, and she has to pretend that she has this like old school life, but she doesn't in fact have it. And it's a great movie. It's hilarious. But it's like, even then, like there is under the current, like just a definite anxiety about the changes that are occurring. Like, and this is an attempt to like give like this sort of lighthearted sort of navigation of these like changing sort of gender norms and whatnot. You can see it too in other ones. Like I was just after Christmas, I watched it as well, like Bishop's Wife, which is a film about an Anglican, or I guess it would be Episcopalian priest or a minister who's trying to build a cathedral, and he sort of like falls out of step with like, in a way his faith, because he's so focused on building the cathedral, and he's sort of like having to spend time like, appealing to rich people and getting them to fund it and whatnot. But you see, like, I think a long way back, art and film negotiating cultural changes and trying to assign make them intelligible and safe to people. It goes all the way back, even like you can read Anna Karenina by Tolstoy or something, and the whole book is just rife with changing cultural norms and people sort of marooned and trying to find a way to navigate them. And yeah, where that goes, I think we're hitting a point where it becomes harder and harder to assign like sort of to make it all make sense, to like assign intelligibility to it. And so I'm kind of always interested by like, the dominant forms today. I think like the art that really resonates is art that like really embraces that uncertainty. And I tend to think like part of the reason hip hop has been like so popular is that it sort of embraces like a new culturally anarchic state where there are no rules, like no one really knows where things are going. And so the only thing that makes sense is to sort of hold tight the people you kind of grew up with and that and to sort of like adopt this more like combative kind of sovereign attitude towards the outside world. It's kind of like a we out there kind of mentality. It's like, so I tend to think like, there's a lot of kind of more cope like description of modern culture that like tries to make it all make sense, tries to assign a clear right and wrong, and like a kind of progressive arc to what's going on. But the art that really resonates with people, I think, like embraces the fact that we're in like pretty anarchic, difficult circumstances, and then meets it with some kind of strength or virtue.
What do you think? So one thing that I it's something that I'm very like militant about is how outdated credentialism is
Mm-hmm.
as a kind of as a not an I guess it could be considered. I mean, it's obviously perpetuated by institutions, but credentialism seems to be something that's very ill-equipped for this. Just
Mm-hmm.
because, right? You have to get grades in classes. Yes, you acquire knowledge. Certainly, you could acquire a network and so on. But just because you're credentialed doesn't mean that you're sovereign. Certainly not. In many ways, you're kind of giving up your sovereignty. I find that there's a lot of groupthink. I mean, if you just think about a lot of like some of the really dysfunctional ideology that exists in our world today, it comes from the university system.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about credentialism and kind of how that seems to be ill-equipped for this moment, as well as like some of the ideologies that kind of come out of it, like virtue signaling,
Mm-hmm.
which I think comes is somewhere in between, coming out of kind of the wokeism that comes out of like the university, and as well as kind of what occurs in Hollywood, which just seems which like that would be what I would call what Gal Gadot was doing, singing Imagine. That's a pure virtue signaling,
Mm-hmm.
act. And people, it's interesting that we somehow, I think the overwhelming majority of people find it incredibly patronizing,
Mm-hmm.
but it's still so powerful.
Right.
And I struggle to understand that.
Right. Yeah, I think like the big underlying condition, I think, that's like, explains both what's going on in the universities and then also others' reactions to it who aren't a part of it, is that basically you have this like really kind of changing, chaotic, set of economic circumstances where, if you basically baseline assume that things are kind of pulling apart and moving in different directions that kind of no one's really intending, and you kind of have this overall state of of kind of more or less cultural, economic sort of chaos that at its best is dynamism, at its worst is just like alienating. I think you have like the university system is sort of like last bastion of like predictable life path, where it's like you go, you get a degree, and then you can work at like Google or you can work at like Goldman Sachs or something. But it's almost like a preserved 1950s sort of path.
Yeah, GI Bill kind of.
Right. It's like, built-in employment, like a built-in life path, when the vast majority of people today just don't have that at all. I think it's much more that you like leave high school and it's just entirely unclear what you do from there,
Right.
and, you might end up just getting a job through an app, you're like, if you're Uber driver, whatever, maybe you end up like trying to make money on social media. Maybe you end up teaching yourself to code. Maybe you end up, working in the service sector, whatever it is. There was no one was instructing you to do it. It's like completely like you're just kind of dumped into the ocean. And this is a thing Bauman talks about a lot, is just like that to be alive today is basically to just be sort of adrift at sea.
Mm-hmm.
And some of us have the benefit, he says, of like kind of having these sort of giant yachts that we sail around in. And I think
Right.
where they're sort of insulated and able to navigate the waves pretty easily. And that's definitely the people who are like in the university system, where like there's just like this built-in community, a built-in path and life orientation, and built-in economic opportunity. Everyone outside of that is in like a totally different situation. And so I think like in terms of the politics and the ideologies that get spawned out of the university, they've got to be kind of understood as being like, coming from this like unique island of like certainty and opportunity. And I think part of it is that if you're the group with this like unique access to opportunity and certainty into this sort of like very nice old way of living,
Mm-hmm.
you have to come up with some way to legitimate access or kind of like a gatekeep access to it.
Right.
And not even just purely in a cynical way, but in a like, if I have this unique opportunity, I have to live up to it on some level. I have to have some way of deciding who gets in and who gets out. And so I think that's kind of part of why you see like a certain sort of moralism on college campuses, is the fact that like in the back of everyone's head is like the notion, they're like, wow, it's really nice in here and it's really tough out there. And, there has to be some way that I can, make sense of why I'm here, why do I have the right to be here. There's like a huge amount of anxiety around it. And I think that that's like a lot of the kind of like college campus, like sort of more like woke kind of, fraught politics that's going on. It's a lot of it, I think, is about that.
One of the things that like I find that I struggle with that like, because I completely agree. And Ross Duthat, if you're familiar with him, he wrote a Decadent Society. He also is like the lone at this point contributor, a conservative contributor on the New York Times opinion page. But he wrote a piece on that. And one of the things that I struggle with there is like that makes perfect sense, right? That makes a lot of sense. The problem is you also have to have a tremendous amount of cognitive dissonance or just like not pay attention, because there are policy prescriptions that are occurring as a result of woke things. So for example, BLM, Black Lives Matter, which has like changed a lot from what it was during when it started in Ferguson, right? Where now when you talk about defund the police, and how it's like demonstrably like obvious that has actually harmed that community. So like at what point, right, do they also say like, okay, not only is it sufficient to virtue signal such that it like validates and and justifies my position of comfort, but like at one point, like are they going to feel like, is there going to be a demand? And maybe this could be seen as why Donald Trump got so much support from minorities, is them holding them accountable and saying, it's not sufficient just for you to virtue signal and say that you understand and you're listening and all these things. Like there has to be outcomes. So I guess that needs to happen. If they're going to be able to continue to do that. Otherwise, they might even hasten them losing society, justifying and believing that they deserve that position.
Yeah, I think when it comes to these sort of like mass sort of like social media, native political movements, it's like it's so important to realize how uncoordinated and like they're just so far from hegemonic, right? Where it's like there are like, even if you take within the kind of more like it's a very broad thing, like it's a meme really, like woke politics is like such a huge span of people that are included in that. And like there are some people who are doing it like quite cynically, where they're just trying to legitimate the privilege they have, and so there's like a virtue signaling thing. It's like kind of thing, if you went to like, it's like a VC that invests in like, new military technologies, like showing, some kind of like displaying like indigenous art or something, that's like the kind of very cynical version. And then there is a very earnest version, which is like someone who's like, wow, I've been given a great life and I see how like exceptional and great it is. I ought to like, give back or like sacrifice in some ways. Like it's like a sort of almost post-Christian sort of impulse to sort of like, to feel like a guilt and like to see the injustice of having this exceptional sort of prosperity. So there's that. And then within like with the like Black Lives Matter sort of movement, I think there's like such an array of people that have kind of like, the meme is just a shelling point, like the term BLM is just a shelling point for tons of different people to sort of, they see it's a wave and a lot of people get on the wave and then try to steer it where they want it to go. And there's tons of people who are in it basically just because they've seen like, like a pretty intense, like some graphic videos and injustices. And then there are some people with like a much more militant ideology that are also jumping in there. And so I think like, when you look at the polling for like the defund the police thing, I think it's like very unclear that there's like robust support for it.
Right.
Because even you can see in like the crime wave that like kind of hit its peak in the 90s, like that there were many people from many different ethnic communities that thought that there should be increased budgets for policing, and that like the kind of like consensus around this is like really loose, and there's a lot of like the narratives around it are attempts to make people think that certain things are normal. So it's like there's just a huge the like the BLM thing is just, it's just such a massive category, I think.
Totally. I don't want to get too bogged down in it because I find it's like kind of such a succubus. So I'm going to pull back out. So one thing, and I think we talked about this in the pre-call. I'm very interested in the axial age. I don't know if you had an opportunity, but just for everyone, right? It's termed by this German sociologist as this period 2,500 years ago, where an enormous coupling of very generative thinkers, ranging from kind of Socrates to religious figures like Buddha, and Jesus Christ of Nazareth and all of these people, that kind of there was a transition basically, or up, it's almost like we moved up a rung of abstraction as a species as a result of this. And I wonder, and basically, right, the axial age is kind of pointed out as like a series of both thinkers and then events. I wonder with post-humanism, I know you're saying, right, this is something that's kind of, and a lot of these thinkers are saying that this is something that's kind of a function of modernity. It's almost like a naturalistic process in some sense. Are there a series of events and a series of people? Oh, you already talked about the people. Are there any events that you would point to in particular? I mean, I think coronavirus is probably an easy one, where it's just where you became to like delineate, and you said like, wow, like this is clearly an example of us not understanding and not being able to control this. Are there things that you could like point to as that you find that are like jumping off points maybe?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it as like, the things that just genuinely on like a visceral level made me, think like that this is a framework exploring. I think a big part of it has been like, I think the rise in like, I think the rise of like services like YouTube and the like kind of rise of social media is just such a massive one, where I can remember like when YouTube was like kind of really young, and you just look at it and everyone's had that experience of sort of diving into it for hours, and just seeing the like absolutely like just how many different narratives and how many different sets of cultural values, etc., can be represented in it. And that like, and you get a sense that like if there was this sort of more hegemonic one-way media system, and when I say one-way media system, I mean like a radio station or like a television network broadcasts one way. It's a central node that broadcasts out to lots of people, and then this is now this sort of two-way network that allows anyone to be a node, anyone to broadcast information. And you just realize like that the ability of society to have like a sort of coherent, like, unified narrative about what it's doing is just shattered. Like that is just gone. And that has to be, and I think we're still like, there's still islands of like the old system around. Like you can watch, spend some time on like Twitter and then watch like, cable news, local cable news. And like the difference in like tenor and like, cable news presents like a sort of story, that's unified, and then Twitter is like a complete cacophony of like different voices. It's like there is no one narrative. It's just completely splintered.
They just use blue check marks basically to try to create some sense of
right. Yeah, there is an attempt to. I think we'll see that. There'll probably be like a counter revolutionary, but it's almost like I think what we're seeing with like social media. Some people say like it's overestimated how big of a factor it is in the sort of bewildering circumstance we're in, and people think it's over estimated. Like it's really about underlying factors. I tend to think it's not the only factor, but it's like a giant one.
Yeah.
And I think it's like akin to like the Gutenberg press revolution, where you have like the Protestant. You can't imagine the Protestant Reformation having happened without the printing press.
Right.
Like even I liked going back to the initial Martin Luther's original theses. And how they were distributed, it's really interesting because he was just a theologian that was trying to levy a few like routine complaints against the church. Like they weren't particularly revolutionary initially, and it was pretty common that local theologians would do this. But the university that he worked at had recently gotten a printing press, and so rather than it just being created once, it was printed like hundreds of times, and so you could estimate that like thousands of people were able to read it. And it sort of took something that would have been routine and it turned it into a political event. Like it suddenly, this like very normal event changed in nature, and it wasn't completely due to the intentions of any participant in it. It was just that the technology available had turned a personal statement into like an act of like secession, basically. And what you saw was that basically the like kind of cultural narratives, the sort of what I'd call like a kind of mimetic equilibrium of Europe at the time was just sort of shattered, where like the cost of putting out new narratives, new ideas just plummeted. And it was like there was a period of chaos and war and like sort of unrest. And I think like there's no way that the internet doesn't have like that sort of similar effect.
If it hasn't already, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's happened in places that were far less institutionally stable already, right? Like, the Middle East during the Arab Spring and so on. And
Right.
You know, and we've seen certain things happen in like Thailand and stuff like that. But now we've also, and I'll kind of use this to get into my next question, which is like, we've also seen it now finally kind of really coming to roost here in the United States. So we talk, what, 3 or 4 days after kind of this big, what some people consider, I mean, I'm not going to belittle it. You know, it was definitely a historical event. You know, I'm just not somebody who thinks it was like a coup or, you know, whatever. I think that gives it a little, and a little being generous, a little too much credit. But what I find interesting about it, right, is so a lot of people pointed that and they were like, that's the, you know, one of the darkest days in America and so on. And I kind of looked at it and for some reason I find, you know, it's a contrarian take that I was like, this is a really good day for America because in the sense like, right, like you had people burst into the Capitol building where, you know, a 200 and some odd year tradition of, you know, the Congress, you know, affirming the electoral college votes, it got disrupted. You know, there was violence. People died. A woman was shot in the halls of the Capitol building. Um, the president like coaxed this in many ways. But they came back like that night and carried it out, and it was rejected. I mean, pretty much unilaterally. Even the people like, you know, Holly and Ted Cruz, they still like condemned the violence of it, right? And you know, we often think about the United States, its institutions, its founding documents as products of the Enlightenment, and perhaps in a humanist frame as well. But if you think about just the scale of the United States, how many narratives, and that this is actually even before like social media, just when there was a frontier and just because of just the different populations who brought their narratives here, and how robust it's been. I mean, you know, people are putting it, it's funny because anyone who knows about like the War of 1812, like the Canadians came down, I mean, they're British, but they're Canadians. Not so nice, I guess. But you know, came burned down the White House and so on, and yet it proceeded. And actually, that, you know, whenever that next election was, they affirmed it. Nonetheless, it was affirmed during the Civil War. So, what do you think about? I'm very interested in the idea that the United States is actually a very good example of a system set up that's actually far more post-human in orientation. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think a few things. I mean, I tend to think that ideas that are sort of have this sort of like high modernist, humanist pretension that the world is like kind of controllable and knowable, they tend to be ideas that sort of are smaller. They make the world smaller in some sense. So like I tend to think that like communism, socialism, you know, in some ways fascism as well, are ideas that try to make the world smaller and more intelligible. And then they try to mobilize people around some clear plan, and it's an idea that you can kind of linearly get from A to B. There's no uncertainty. There's a prophecy. We're going to play it out, right? Like, and those have been pretty much uniformly like pretty destructive. They might have had some role in like mobilizing people for war, but that's about it. And then the ideas that I tend to think of as more like post-human are ideas that are in some ways like bigger than the people that have them and hold them. They're sort of like they make the world bigger. They sort of are comprised of like based on some like kind of genuine understanding of nature or like some basic like very like kind of foundational principles about how things will work, and then it's sort of like more of a procedure or an algorithm that you run, and you're not thinking that there's like an ultimate utopia or place that we get, but they're sort of like a process. They're ideas that are more of like a process for how to govern, how to live. The US has a couple big ideas that are like in its founding that I think of as being potentially post-human, which is both the sort of like kind of liberalism, which is like a kind of really maligned idea by a lot of people on the fringes today, but I think it still like has a huge amount of like robustness, and that is basically like, you know, that there, you know, that the law is above any person, and like the Constitution itself is a document that isn't the product of like the latest whims or ideology or some reflexive like reaction to an event where it would be really tempting for like a Harvard professor to say, oh, Corona's happened, we need to restructure the government in this way, now we need to live in this sort of like public health state. Like the Constitution sets all of these like hard limits on what the government can do, and I think in some ways like makes it more robust. So I think that like that the US is sort of liberal strain. And when I say liberal, I mean more of like a kind of classically liberal, rule of law, norms around contract, tolerance, free speech. Like these are protocols that if you run them they may not work perfectly every time, but there's good reason for each of them, especially like things like the like kind of rule of law, predictability of contract. Like that's basically the best thing the US has economically, like going forward. I think it's that the US is a place where if you have wealth, if you like invest and if you build something, you're very likely to be able to hold on to it for like 200 years. Like that's kind of like one of the best things about it from like a sort of foreign investment standpoint. I think things like the Constitution and sort of liberal governance do that. And part of that, and then the two kind of other ideas that I think are big that the US has that make me kind of still bullish on it, despite the kind of like current anxieties, is one is like kind of federalism, which is just the sort of more like decentralized nature of US governance.
People really don't understand that. In Europe in particular, like I talked to, they just, like France. So like I have cousins in the north of France. And I have friends. I lived in South Korea with a bunch of Parisians. Talked to some of them. And the president of France is a very powerful person. They're like if Donald Trump, if we were France, it would be a lot more concerning if you had somebody that was unhinged. But like, that's not how things are kind of set up. People don't understand, right? He passes a Muslim ban, that's what it was coined, and then a judge in Hawaii, like the farthest state away from where he signed that law, can then reject that law, and so strike down that law. And that decentralization of federalism, I find it's so misunderstood outside of the United States, and it makes me understand that our brand of federalism, because federalism exists, I believe, like in Brazil and India, and in Singapore and Switzerland, but our brand of federalism is very, very robust, and very different.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
and there's an amendment to the Constitution that guarantees it.
Right. Yeah, and it's like the notion that federalism is basically like fundamentally has a humility to it, which is that the rules that ought to govern like this one geographic area it's not knowable how every region should be governed, and that there should be some kind of like gradual feedback process where people in Oregon figure out how they ought to govern themselves, and people in Texas figure out how they ought to govern themselves, and I think there is like a real humility to it, and it's kind of like, as like kind of Taleb would say too, that it's sort of if there's an error made on a small scale, then the effects of it are limited. If you have a whole country betting really hard on one thing and it goes wrong, then you've like caused a real problem. And so I think that like again, it's like I think the post-human ideas, which is like it's a very broad bucket. Like I see the sort of like post-human frame as being this sort of big continent of ideas that lies in a conception of modernity that doesn't presume we have control over it. There's a lot of different ideas that can inhabit that space. One of them has to be federalism, I think. The other thing that America has that's really big, and you can see this like in sort of America's founding. There's a professor I had in college, Elvin Lim, who has a book. This is called The Lover's Quarrel, which is really good. And it's about sort of that America had both the sort of like founding as a republic and then a founding as like a liberal state, and that the sort of Declaration of Independence is a document that's fundamentally has the spirit of a republic, and then the Constitution is like a liberal document. And the difference being there that when the republic was founded, it was kind of like an attempt to instantiate these sort of like classical virtues, that you'd have a government that was run by good men, basically. And people like Jefferson wanted to put in place all of these rules that would avoid the kind of corruption of like finance and of economic dealings. So he wanted to have like a limit on the amount of property that anyone could have.
Interesting for such a rich man.
Yeah, right. And there was this sort of ideal that like these anti-federalists and people like Jefferson had, which was that America would be this country of sort of yeoman farmers that like had a robust independence. And this wasn't like so much like a utopian idea, like a sort of like socialist endpoint. It was sort of like just a belief that like you should have rugged and independent people who are virtuous, and that whatever happens, things will work out if you have that. And I think America still has that strain in it.
Certainly.
And I think so. You've got this kind of like Republican, like, and when I say Republican, I mean like the Republic, like this notion of the Republic. You have this sort of like liberalism, rule of law, and then you have federalism. And all three of those ideas, they're ideas that are about a process. They're not about an end state. And they sort of are ideas that have a lot of humility baked into them. That being said, I think America kind of has like a bit of a tortured situation right now, in part because World War II and the sort of mass mobilization there brought into birth a lot of like high modernist institutions.
Right.
It's like that's where like the federal government explodes in size and authority. It's the sort of like world of FDR, the world of like the Department of Everything, education, etc. And that is a world that's trying to know, and that's kind of dominated by like sort of intellectuals from major universities. And that's a world of kind of planning that I think like has its role in like mobilizing for war, but I don't think it necessarily is the best one for dealing with like uncertainty. And so I think in a way like we're seeing the decay of a bunch of institutions that were built for a very specific purpose, which was to sort of like mass mobilize America.
Mhm.
And there's nothing to mobilize for now in terms of a war. And so we're seeing a lot of those institutions fray. And I kind of hope that people will fall back on some of those more robust older traditions that are in America that are pre-World War. Like America was such a different place before the World Wars. It was like California had like barely anyone living in it, you know, and it was like, you know, the federal government was dramatically smaller. It was kind of like a more emergent process that America was running. And then the Second World War like made it more technocratic and top down. I think we're like seeing the decay of that. And I think even to what you were saying before around like the nation state, like that even is a model like the nation state that is like really particular. It's like the nation state reaches its peak, you know, with the world wars. Like it's something that's built as like, you know, interstate competition in Europe intensifies, nation states form, become more robust, the state becomes more powerful. War ultimately drives like everyone towards a form of like war socialism. And then after the war, there's just no rationale for a lot of these things to exist. And I think some people lament the decline of some of those big, powerful institutions. But I think that like there is no future where humanity survives with like mass mobilized wars at this point. And the path forward is much more being able to harness like unpredictability and uncertainty. And a lot of those World War II era institutions learned the exact wrong reason, maybe the right reason for the time in winning a war,
Right.
but the wrong lessons for now. And yeah.
So there are two things that I point to that I find, you know, really reaffirming of, you know, I'm a big bull on the United States of America. And you know, I just think it, like a lot of the things that people are currently like stressed or worried about, like I look at that same exact occurrence and I'm like, that's a great sign. So for example, like the dysfunction of San Francisco. San Francisco was you know, probably still is, you know, the technological center of the United States in an era when technology is often the competitive advantage between nation states, and a good indicator for economic robustness. That's really important. It's really, and thus it's like very concerning, right? That the governance of San Francisco is so terrible. Like that seems to be like and any other country, right? That would be like that's like a national security issue, right? Because they don't have, you know, most countries have one really major urban center. You have London, you have Paris, you know, you have you know, so on. So, but here you see, right, an enormous, you know, flow of people. Like there really is really robust, and this is also probably one of the reasons why the United States had a little bit more difficult time with COVID. There's a freedom movement of people between large geographic areas. So Texas has become a big winner, which is, you know, from a, if you think about those two states, California and Texas, they're as diametrically opposite in the in the view of governance as possible. Or Miami, which has kind of picked up a lot of things because their mayor was able to kind of utilize, take some of that unpredictability and kind of use a social media account of Twitter to channel people into a city, like very effectively. So I think that's an example. And then also, you know, you think about department, and we talked about briefly, like, you know, credentialism, but the Department of Education, and education obviously being such a, you know, an important kind of input for future long-term, you know, prosperity. I like have only recently learned, for example, that like homeschooling is illegal in most countries in the world. Like a large swath of Europe, like East Asia in its entirety, basically. And in the United States, you've seen like a huge movement towards homeschooling, and then also all this being undergirded by technology. And one of the things that I find interesting maybe about our conception of technology being like largely software delivered through computation is that it's basically allowed us to, a lot of the things that that Rooseveltian, you know, state was responsible for, you can now do using software and it can be highly differentiated because there can be multiple instantiations of kind of the same like thing. Like you can have a homeschooling delivered by multiple different institutions with different people, with different you know focuses and so on, and so you get a diverse group of people all of a sudden like going through that, and all of those things like lead me to say like, whoa, like there's something really interesting going on here. Like it's when America is often being looked at as being like on the tipping point, where I'm like, it's shown that it's much more able to regulate itself
Right.
than I had ever imagined.
Yeah. I think that's I share some of those sentiments for sure. I think to me, it's like where America ends up being kind of in the most awkward situations that are like kind of the biggest failures is when it tries to do this sort of centralized, top down sort of like kind of big social projects. So you have things like it's like with the COVID response. It's like we basically just knee-jerk reaction panicked and then tried to copy what China was doing, but we have absolutely no way of following through on it, right? Like in China, they're willing to use like much more authoritarian kind of
doors.
doors, police flying drones around telling people to go inside, and then not to mention like the huge underlying factor has to be that everyone in China is just Chinese, and like you can basically everyone will feel comfortable holding each other to account. It's like you imagine being in like, somewhere in China and you kind of like everyone has quite a lot in common. And I think that allows people to, feel comfortable holding each other to the rules, and saying like, hey, like, you need to be wearing a mask. You go and everyone just wears a mask and everyone sort of like conforms to that. And that works for them. In America, it's just never going to happen. Right. Like, it's just never going to happen that you're walking around New York City, you see someone from some completely other part of the world, some other walk of life, and you're going to feel like going up to them and saying like, hey, you better be wearing a mask or whatever. Like the level of social cohesion required to do this like top down COVID response is just not there. And you could have imagined America like leaning into what it is much more, where it would have been like, we are going to protect the weak, we're going to protect people who are vulnerable. But other than that, it's going to be like a personal responsibility thing. You could have seen it going in that direction. It's all hard in hindsight because like, we didn't know if the virus was going to be like dramatically more deadly than it was.
Right.
But that's a response that like America could have done, where it could have been that, it's like we really go out of our way, mobilize like civil society to look after people who need it, but then you let people work who want to work, and you help people gauge their own like risk levels, and that's something you could have done. And I think like what we ended up doing was sort of like the most awkward in between, where we were neither willing to like take the bitter pill of like sort of top down authoritarianism and really cutting back and doing like a hard lockdown, and we also weren't willing to lean into a sort of like more buccaneering like freedom where some people will be hurt, neither. And so instead we've ended up in this middle course where it's like long extensive lockdowns that no one has a stomach to really enforce. And so you just end up with like the worst of both worlds. And I think you see it too with like say like American education too, like you're saying, where there's just like an immense desire that people have to educate their kids in their own way. Sure. Like, and you see like, especially in a lot of more like religious states, people want charter schools and they want more local control. And I think like the most weird kind of awkward things America has is where it tries to do these sort of top down things. Like no one really is excited to receive like a dictate from the Department of Education they have to teach in a certain way. And one other thing I'll just throw out there, just like this is a story I love that kind of drives the point home around like the kind of culturally heterogeneous nature of America and how it interplays with these big social projects is like I lived in Denmark for a while, and in Denmark they have obviously like extensive social services, and everyone has this like immense level of like social consensus to the point at which if you want to name your baby something, you have to check that the name is on a list, so you can't name your kid something off the list without petitioning. In America, you try to have universal health care and immediately it's about abortion, immediately all of the social divisions that there are just flare up. And it just seems to me like you have to, you either can try to like do a campaign where you try to remove all of those differences and force everyone to view things the same way. And I think what that will do is just cause people to sort of dig in and want to defund the state and not
Right.
contribute anything to public services, and they'll just be this sort of scorched earth libertarianism.
Right.
Or you can kind of embrace, like, people aren't on the same page, and there needs to be room for like self-governance and more, decentralized ways of administering public services.
So I'm super happy that you brought up Denmark, because I think that so you talked about like pre-World War II, America was a very different place, and the worldview of America was very, very different. I'll plug the book that you recommended to me, The Metaphysical Club, which talks about a lot of the early thinkers in pragmatism and transcendentalism around the Civil War. And whether you were like a very militant abolitionist or a unionist or a Confederate, certain things you did, you certainly believed were kind of like in the ruggedness of the individual, the self-reliance, which although came like from as a term in transcendentalism, that was something that was widely viewed in the United States and was also kind of absorbed by immigrant populations as they came in. We've, in my opinion, have imported this top-down, this wanting to do top-down governance, because particularly in the cosmopolitan centers of the United States, on the left, we have fetishized a lot of Europe and like European governance and a view of their countries with the same lack of understanding of the differences between us and them as they, exhibit to us. There are immigrants, yes, in Denmark. It is not even close to, even during the Trump years, we had 1 million immigrants a year in the United States. People just can't even know there are what, 5 million people in Denmark, or so on, 8 million people. So people also, they misunderstand the scale, like the difference in cultural heterogeneity in the population. And so I really feel like on the left in particular, we have imported this idea, like, well, look at how high, like the quality of life that they have, and so on, and also overestimating how different that is, when it really does come down to like some very, very core things, which is really probably the cost of higher education, healthcare, and that's and maybe infrastructure,
right.
which is something that we can do. Like, infrastructure is not really something that I think we're hindered to do. We will likely see it with a unified government in the next 2 years. So what do you think about that? Because that's where I really think we've done that. And actually, I'll add to that I think the most high modern institutions that still exist in the United States are the regulatory bodies. So for example, like the FDA, we had the Moderna vaccine, what was it, like 6 days or 8 days after they sequenced the genome, and it took however many months, 10 months to approve it. And one thing that I also wasn't aware of before the coronavirus is how much regulatory harmony still stems from the United States. So like, countries still look at the United States to harmonize their regulatory thing. So great, now we're exporting this incredibly sclerotic, view of things. So those two things, what we are exporting, which is very antithetical to many of the ways that America used to view things, and then what we're importing from, I believe, continental Europe.
Right. Yeah, I do think there is when people are sort of like hungry to find some sort of model that we should be following, I think like they're looking abroad for something. And I think the like Scandinavian social democracy is one that people latch onto. And I do think it is like a bad one to latch onto, just primarily because it's got to be like the most sort of unique social equilibria you can find. There's just like, you're taking this incredibly tiny part of the world and like assuming that they found like a universal model.
Correct.
And I think all you need to do to be a little more skeptical of that is like, if you either talk to someone from there or visit or watch like movies from there, you'll just see that it's like in Denmark, like it's almost like everyone's related. Like it is on that level. Like even the Copenhagen like real estate market with apartments, like apartments just get passed on intergenerationally. People just know each other from like the towns they're from. There's just an immense amount of like kind of cultural consensus. It's even like the way you decorate your kitchen is like generally agreed upon. Like, you'd have like white, like marble kind of tabletops. You would never have another color. Like, it's just an immense level of consensus. And that plays into like an incredible willingness that people have to fund public services, because they have an expectation of the conduct of the people who will leverage them. And there's just like so many shared so much shared like kind of norms that it supports this. And then it's also too that like some of that social democracy sort of stuff is really like a product of post-war Europe as well, where it's like there were just populations that had sacrificed so much for a war effort, and an elite that was really willing to compromise at that point in time and offer more expansive social services. It's not to say you can't have any today, but like looking at something that's like a really particular equilibria, the product of like this one path dependent process, and then saying like America should do the same thing, I think is tough. I think America could do it in that like Vermont is kind of like a social democracy, or Massachusetts is kind of like a social democracy.
Just before we started recording, you were raised rather primarily in Massachusetts, and I've just come back from New Hampshire, and we were talking about how far more European in a sense it is, because there's these families that have been there for very, very long periods of time. There's a lot of whether it's homes and other things that are passed down intergenerationally, and then you also you see. I know Massachusetts, I'm not sure about Vermont, they have universal healthcare at the state level.
Right.
So you see, and I find that interesting, and almost is a proof of concept there. And then what's also interesting is that if to zoom out for the United States, that makes perfect sense. The United States, and we talked about federalism, you are running multiple experiments at the same time.
Right.
And I guess if there was just a little bit of understanding and appreciation for one, how amazing that is. Two, you have freedom of movement between people, so you can choose your experiment. The tech elite and the VC elite from San Francisco are like cashing out of that experiment in San Francisco, and they're going to a different place where which they appreciate the experiment being run far better. And so yeah, that's just something that I just seen. We just touched on that, like so you talked about Vermont, and I just we see.
Yeah, I think too. It's like there's definitely something that the media has done as well. And it isn't to say there aren't like tons of very real problems. Like I do think like one of the big underlying problems of the period we're in is that, the like post-war period was this period of like exceptional equality and like investment in public services and immense demand for American labor. And it like produced this really buoyant, like kind of like helpful set of economic circumstances that like elevated standards of living, et cetera. And then we're kind of seeing that unwind on some level, and it's going to be painful. There's roles for the state in dealing with that and making sure that people aren't left behind. But I do think the solutions are likely very different in different states. And I think something the media kind of does is it kind of universalizes conflicts which shouldn't be like the gun control debate is always one that's interesting, where it's like it's no wonder that if you live in like New York or Chicago you think there should be gun control. Like
of course
it makes sense, but if you live in like Wisconsin, like you don't think there should be gun control.
I talk about this all the time with people. I'm like, have you ever been to a really rural part of the United States? So like my parents have a place in New Mexico, like outside Santa Fe, so it's still like pretty populated, but like you go to places, just to give people a sense, some people, I've got a couple people like outside of the United States who listen to this. New Mexico is the size of Germany and has 2 million people.
Right.
If you were that disconnected from the mandate of use of force that police officers have, right? You would want, to be able to protect yourself. It's just, and if you don't have that, and I've heard some solutions proposed about this where it's like, the equivalent to like what Jews go through like on birthright, where you can go to Israel, but like an equivalent in the United States where it's like if you're from a cosmopolitan center, go to a rural center and vice versa, and understand how different those worlds are. Yeah. And maybe you would appreciate why you fall on different sides of an issue.
Right. Yeah. It's because it's definitely that, like, I think there's tons of things that could be improved or changed in America. But it's just that I tend to not have faith that the solution is the same across the whole thing. That is, for me, the thing. It's like, I don't think the lessons learned in like a sort of state of like immense real estate and social service scarcity in like San Francisco necessarily apply to like, to Texas or like Wisconsin. Like, they're different lessons for different places. The answers aren't universal, in my opinion. And I think something that's happened that is a real shame, I do think social media is partly to blame for it. I don't know if it's other things, is I think people have a lot of like cultural pessimism that really hurt, because America is ultimately a bet on an unplanned process in many
Right.
ways. Like it's sort of like a bunch of people have showed up. They're gonna have people are gonna have different ways of doing things to each other, and you kind of on some level have to have faith that whatever process people you don't know are running is gonna work. You know,
Right.
and it's gonna like and it's not like antagonistic. It will be to some degree. There's going to be antagonism, and there's plenty of history of different groups like butting heads in America. But like at the core of it, there has to be some like ability for exit, and there has to be some ability to like trust in an unplanned process. And I think today people there's a loss of that like kind of cultural optimism that sort of like okay, we don't know what's going to happen but it's going to work. And I think you could imagine like the sort of plans like I find really interesting are like allowing social services and public funding to be like used and distributed in a way that gives more local community control, not less. It's like if you have like a local county or state, like letting them invest, say where you there's X problem, but you guys need to figure out how to execute on it, how to that I prefer more to like some kind of grand big educational reform or like a big healthcare reform. It's not clear to me why we increasingly think that things need to be done on the federal level. I don't know. Yeah.
Let me hit the restroom real quick. I'm sorry. I
Sure,
drank
yeah.
a lot of coffee and
I'm gonna get some more coffee then.
All right, so I want to be like respectful of your time. I blocked off like until 1. That's cool.
Yeah, until one's fine.
All right, cool. All right. So yeah, I think we've really hammered that home well, like in terms of and actually, to pick up on one thing that you were talking about that I think is worthwhile to just go deeper in just slightly is um the fact that, right, like the media, social media have tried to kind of take the dominant narrative and push it onto a very wide swath. So like the idea that, like, for example, I would argue, right, assault weapon ban as gun control, for example, that's probably a belief held by the majority of Americans, right? And thus it then gets pushed. And like we could talk about whether or not like assault rifles. I mean, I lived in Israel where there were M16s all around and stuff like that, and like um there was a lot more reason for it there than here. Like, yeah, different context. But anyway, one of the things I also find very interesting is that Americans also don't understand their governance system, right? So like they're really up in arms here in New York City about gun control. It's like there is very strict gun control in New York, like very, very strict. So a lot of the people, unless you are like, the gay teenager in Bumblefuck, Oklahoma, or maybe you're just like an ardent, believer, like, but there's once again freedom of exit, which you talk about, right? Yeah. Where people can then come, you can move, you come to the big city, where your views are held. I think now more than ever, you're probably also seeing, right, a reverse of that, of people moving out of cosmopolitan areas to places that they feel like are far more and so as long as we have that, and people just seem to not understand that. People like, so it's like you live in a place you don't have to go to a place that's different than you gain a lot more utility. That you still gain a utility though from being in a union of those states. And I think that's probably the thing that's like the most shaky at the moment, and the biggest concern is like people not understanding what the value is of you live in New York City and Kansas exists. And it's like, cool. How much of your food is grown in New York City? Do you know? Like, do you understand that? So, anyway, I just find that interesting.
Yeah, no, definitely, and it's, yeah, I agree. I generally agree that I think there's like just a lot of political narratives spun up, and then a lot of like resentment and sort of alienation comes from the fact that people hear about something, it's presented in a certain way, and then it doesn't line up with their experience at all. I think everyone's having these experiences of like, it's like, there's a like gun control narrative. There's someone saying, guns should be like very accessible. Someone saying it should be restrictive. If you live in like a suburb in like Massachusetts and your only touch point with guns is like you're scared there'll be like a school shooting, like then that's going to be very different than someone who lives in a rural state or somewhere much more remote, and it's like just sort of either a recreational activity or defense or hunting or whatever. Like it's just
also recreational activity is interesting, right?
Yeah,
it's like cool. Like we're sitting in New York City. It is. I mean, yes, coronavirus is going on, but like there's even under coronavirus, right? There's still a lot to do. I think when we were talking, you were like still like you were appreciating like the energy of the city still and so on. Yeah. Right. That's why people move to New York City or cities, because there's shit to do.
Right.
If you're
it's
in the middle of nowhere, shooting a gun is probably the closest you're going to get to a skill, but it's also like some of the more like high adrenaline and entertainment that you could possibly have.
Right. Yeah, it's. Yeah, so I do think there's definitely some problem there. And I also, I think another thing I wonder about is just, you look at where people's taxes go, and the federal taxes just so outweigh state taxes. Like state taxes are negligible in comparison to the federal amount that in most states that's levied. In fact, I think in virtually every state. And so you just, you wonder like if a lot more of that tax revenue is going to the state level, then because I think a complaint people have about federalism, it tends to be more like on the left, where people are eager to fund certain public services. They see like really limited state budgets, and they think like, okay, like there's no way I can accomplish these goals on the state level. It's like, it should be, I think, that more tax revenue is funneled through the states where it's more accessible. You can literally, take a short drive to go to the Capitol building, and you can sit in on a hearing or a bill being voted on very easily. And compared to going to Washington, and you can have much more control over where the money goes. And I think it is a shame that the federal government has sort of like sucked up people's willingness to fund public services, and then just generally misappropriates it. You want
to know what's find interesting about that? So then, if you think about, for example, Texas and Florida, a lot of them are experiencing big inflows of people, and it's because they have 0% state taxes. Right. So these are states that, I mean, they gain their revenue elsewhere, right? Through other things. But I just find it interesting that they levy a 0% state income tax.
Yeah.
I just find that kind of a little.
No, definitely. Yeah. No, I mean, you're seeing like, I think hopefully the good that comes out of that too is that because there are some viable alternatives that are like pursuing a low tax experiment, places like New York and SF are forced to think deeply about how they spend tax money and trying to,
I was almost making the point that Texas and Florida are using the federal government, having an outsized, taxes that they levy, and they're using their state tax as a competitive advantage.
They are, yeah.
So they're almost like succumbing to that reality in many ways.
Yeah,
which they would probably hate to like hear that said, but and then they're making the best of that situation and kind of espousing their values and their view of the world within that framework. But like we've succumbed and kind of in many ways we have legitimized and almost instantiated and ossified. That Rooseveltian.
I agree. I think too, people, there's just and maybe in some cases perhaps for good reason, it's not like a simple issue, but people have a pessimism about what will happen if states are left to their own devices. I think like the social issues primarily have become this like major source of pessimism, where you basically imagine that like a red states will become theocracies, like kind of racist theocracies, and then left states will become like Jacobin socialist republics or something.
Right.
when and that's kind of like the meme,
Yeah.
but I don't think that's necessarily true. And I think like that is the reason for the sort of like post Civil War, consensus that the Bill of Rights kind of supersedes state legislation and ensures there's some, there's a baseline where state governments can't go too far. But I think with that in place, like you would hope there'd be some room to allow states to experiment. I think another policy that's been thrown around as well that I find like interesting is subsidizing exit. Like should there be like a federal grant for people who want to move from state to state, where if you don't have the like economic ability to move and you want to, should you be given it? Like I think that's an interesting idea at the least.
Yeah, that's a super interesting idea. Okay, I just want to point out one thing and then we'll shift because I want to spend the last part of this talking in the crypto space. So Georgia's a really great example of why that that very simple narrative of southern states or like red states being kind of these racist places and then like the Democrats or Democratic blue states being kind of these socialist Jacobian places. Because I hear a lot of like interesting things, particularly in the VC and tech space, right? In Atlanta, where they're like, Atlanta is Wakanda, people say, which is a very techno utopian futurist. It's a very optimistic view of it. Is kind of very antithetical to the cynical view of BLM of like the Black America is just this never going to kind of transcend this oppression, despite having the first kind of Black president, mixed race president already, and also just devalues like the Black excellence in American society, which I find is like so amazing, right? Like you talked about hip hop, so in the cultural sphere, far more generative, than probably any other population of people in the United States. If you look at athletics, which are obviously, where a lot of people find their cultural heroes and stuff like that.
Right.
Black America is overwhelmingly represented. I remember when I lived in South Korea, they thought that like 50% of America was Black, just because all the people that, if you look at like the percentage of people that they see, they just assume, which I find very interesting. Okay, just to shift, you work in the crypto space, and I wonder if blockchains, DeFi, Bitcoin are almost applied philosophy of post-humanism.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? And I could see the two of those things having an interplay for you.
Yeah. Oh, they definitely do. And one of the things that's kind of pushed me towards this frame too has been working in the crypto space. And it's kind of the fact that we're basically, I think of Bitcoin especially as being this like emergent phenomena out of the internet. Like it has this sort of like legendary anonymous founder, Satoshi, but what it's actually turned out to be has not been the design of any one person really at all. Early Bitcoin history, people didn't realize at all that Bitcoin might appreciate in value. It was just like a settlement layer, a decentralized settlement layer for payments, like peer-to-peer electronic cash. But it wasn't clear to people that it was going to become this like sort of digital gold. And still to be seen whether that pans out, although I'm bullish on it.
Yeah.
But
it seems to me like that's the use case that is the most generative right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one that was like kind of emerged out of the sort of like
debasement of the US dollar.
And also the kind of the fact that holders mentality, people who hold the coin.
Just define what holders.
Sure, someone who like holds Bitcoin or like hodls it, like they're a long-term holder of the coin. They're like planning on just holding it until it's mainstream adopted. That like kind of practice has interacted with meme culture in like a really weird way, where it sort of infused memes with financial incentives, and it sort of like caused this like insanely huge internet presence for Bitcoin. And that was not like a kind of chemical reaction that anyone anticipated. Satoshi Nakamoto wasn't like, oh, this is going to be huge for the memes. He didn't say that at all. It was like, that was just something that happened. And anyway, but I think like I see it as both like the crypto stuff is like a kind of weird emergent internet phenomena. And then I also see it as basically being like, if you take the liberal political project, which is basically just like predictable contract, like rule of law, certain like rights and sovereignty of individuals protected from the state. Crypto is like the most live set of like place for experimentation of that sort of way of thinking. Like Bitcoin is fundamentally like a sort of strange other world where contract and ownership are sort of absolute. And then like Ethereum as well is like an attempt to sort of be like a playground for contract theorists to build, you know, free market systems that are like resistant from state or like, you know, kind of any interference from the outside. And so I do tend to think like that. I think like crypto is a first stab at something of like a sort of more cybernetically aware liberalism that's sort of like more robust, more of like an attempt to make liberalism independent of any like culturally particular foundations. It's like liberalism sort of trying to emancipate itself from a society that's sort of drifting in other directions that may not have the same kind of ability to support predictable contract and rule of law. Crypto is an attempt to like almost emancipate economics from like the cultural sphere to make it more robust. And in that way, I think it's like if you expect the future to be kind of tumultuous and chaotic, and kind of you don't know where it's going to go, it's quite likely it may go in a direction that doesn't support a lot of old liberal norms that are culturally path dependent. They're from a particular time and place. They're not universal. And if you want to keep those things alive, I think crypto is like an attempt to make them inevitable, make them sort of like sovereign. Yeah.
So I don't know, you know, your opinion on him, and I know it is varied, but I did. There was this really interesting Twitter thread from Raoul Paul talking about, you know, how people who are very, you know, they're often like some of the really big sell-offs of Bitcoin in the past couple months have been out of fear of regulation by the government.
Right.
And he was actually making a call of like why you should be happy and so on and so forth. But one of the threads he talked about was basically the idea and the introduction of like this concept, right, of like, you know, so we're really like we're behind China in this idea of an introduction of a digital coin from the Federal Reserve or the central bank. And the idea that also not just contract theorists and just kind of figuring out how that could be done, but particularly in the realm of programmable currencies and contracts. So, for example, people, when they looked at the stimulus checks, one of the things that people were very concerned about was that really what we saw those stimulus checks were used for was either they were put right into savings by some people argue shouldn't have received them. There were also people who just paid down debt. You know, and a lot of consumers, you know, actually the you know the individual balance sheet, you know, of an American consumer is in really great shape relative to where it's kind of been in the last maybe 20 some odd years. And you haven't, because you haven't seen that pay down in debt met with increased consumption. And so his idea, right, is like imagine a you know, a federal government that you really no longer also, by the way, have a relationship with a bank. Right. You have just a one-to-one relationship with the central bank, and there can be programmability where it's like you have 1 month or whatever they want the velocity of money to be to spend that money, and you have to spend it. Maybe you can pay down consumer debt, but you can't put it into savings because it'll perish over that period of time. What do you think about that? Because so it does defend some of the, you know, the libertarian kind of cipher and anarcho, you know, people, and it kind of, but it does have these, and it has an institutional frame. Can both things be true at the same time? I think kind of what we've talked about is that certainly in the United States, it definitely seems like both those things can, you know, adhere. And I'll finish the question by saying, you know, Bitcoin is heavily mined in China. I think it's the, you know, but when you talk about like where it's being used, and if you look at the ownership of it, crypto, in my opinion, really does seem, there are other areas that if you want to talk about what's going on in South America and stuff like that, but do you see that also a reason to be optimistic about America is that it also lends itself to kind of transitioning from this kind of federal, you know, Rooseveltian federalist state to some kind of crypto state, which Balaji has talked about, or a network state that he's talked about, or what do you think about all that? That was a lot.
No, that's all right. Yeah, so I think in terms of like central bank digital currencies, and then the sort of more, you call them like kind of free banking, like bottom up Bitcoin sort of movement. I think those will both probably be two strong narratives into the future. Like I think there's a bunch of reasons why like nation states would want to utilize crypto, both because they can administer monetary policy more directly, and with like kind of more like just with a direct relationship with the end user, with like the citizenry, rather than going through the banks and dealing with all the sort of moral hazard problems that entails. So I think that's like really interesting. I think the other thing they could do with it as well is, if you want to push adoption of your currency, you suddenly can do so, where you can, if I say America wanted to bring the dollar to like Mexico or something, Mexicans would then be able to hold the US dollar without the permission of their bank digitally, right? They could have like self-custody over a US dollar. So I think there's like definitely a narrative of like kind of hyper-dollarization or like an aggressive pushing of the yuan through a digital currency into
Right,
other
that's
countries.
always been a concern, and that's probably been a lot of the regulatory backlash on
Yeah,
Tencent
Alipay
and
and whatnot.
Alipay and all that. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. So I think it could result in some renewed kind of monetary competition between states. Um, but I do think basically that the most interesting thing about crypto is the fact that it's like more or less sovereign, and that it's like a sort of, if you want predictable wealth storage, transfer, financial contract that's reliable internationally, and you think the world's going to get more chaotic, then you kind of want a system that's outside of state control. And that's kind of was the dream of like a lot of kind of neoliberal theorists like Hayek or Mises or and others. Like they were sort of the Geneva school, of the Austrian school, and then of like kind of these economists that sort of kind of grouped around Geneva in the after the kind of First and Second World War to try to think like how can liberal commerce, how can capitalism sort of survive in a world of these sort of swaggering nation states that may want autarky, or like they may not want to engage in fair trade. And I think they tried to do this where they were, thinking like, how can we make commerce insulated from politics? And I think crypto is very much like a similar project to that. And so I think like there will be this role for the central bank digital currencies, but I think like the more robust, like sort of, if you think of where modernity is going, what does it need to continue to survive? That's like free and open commerce and predictable, like kind of contract and ownership of wealth. And I think crypto is like a bet on, maintaining that.
So I completely understand in the United States and basically everywhere other than China, it seems that view of crypto, and I don't know, so I'm gonna ask the question, like where like that freedom of exit and the ability to kind of have a separation of commerce and finance from politics seems totally possible. In China, it doesn't. I don't know if I'm wrong there, and that actually they have seen the ability. There is this actual movement and robustness that exists, and it's actually my big reason of why I'm very bearish in the medium term on China, let alone the demographics and the debt issues that they have, and I tweeted yesterday that I really thought that Pompeo had just basically normalized relations with Taiwan, and I said that all the democracies should join in, and the Quad, which is comprised of, for those who don't know, the United States, India, Australia, and Japan, should kind of go to the South China Sea and watch as China chooses trying to traverse the middle income trap over Taiwan, because they would, in my belief. But it's why I'm so bearish on, just if we could, I don't know, like just to say that like China's a very modern, it is a high modernist country of the nth degree,
right,
par excellence today for sure.
Right.
Am I wrong? Is there some robust activities in the crypto space that have remained resilient to the CCP? Am I right? In which case, are we actually in the post-humanist frame really looking at a rising power that will be short-lived?
Yeah, I think there definitely is a ton of crypto activity in China. It's where the biggest exchanges are or originated and then left.
Binance.
Yeah, and then like OKX and Huobi are two of the biggest exchanges in the world, and they're Chinese.
And they left though.
I mean,
Binance is in Malta.
Binance left, but OKX and Huobi are still there, as far as I know. And yeah, there's a huge amount of interest. Like some of it just kind of like gambling oriented, but that's how it is in the West too. There's a huge amount of like kind of gambling, speculative interest. But then there's also a lot of people using cryptocurrencies to move money in and out of China.
Right.
To get around capital controls and to sort of engage in free commerce where it's not possible. So they'll use like stable coins and they'll buy them over the counter, move large amounts of money out to like America or somewhere else. And so that's happening. And I think when you look at like to what extent can China stifle this, it's like they can regulate the point at which yuan turns into crypto. Like they can try to regulate that transaction. But once you're in crypto, it's like it's another realm. Like it's a completely permissionless area where you can leverage like decentralized applications or move money wherever you want. And so I think it's like fairly unlikely that they'll be able to quash it completely. They can make it really difficult, but I think it's the ecosystem is just becoming more and more censorship resistant.
Right.
And it's still continued to thrive today. And it's also like, even in a pretty like authoritarian state like China, like the state isn't like a like hegemonic. It's not one thing. Like there'll be party officials who use crypto to like move money around.
Well,
And
sure,
it kind
right?
of like, yeah. So it's,
Well,
it kind of starts to
they're the
break
people who are often pushing money out of the country, right? I mean,
yeah.
I know examples of that, like very like I know people, who, and you know, I actually, no, I won't say it, but yeah, I mean, certainly that's true.
Right. Yeah, and then as to like the bigger point of, whether like China as like a kind of top-down experiment will work in the future, the thing I will say that I'm somewhat sympathetic to is almost all like of the sort of that early industrializing process has like a top-down authoritarian nature. Like there,
Right.
it's never been,
must, right?
yeah, it's never been like this sort of thing where like the like rural peasantry have like freely left their land and wanted to like build computers or like it's just that isn't how it's worked. Like even in the UK, which is like one of the most sort of organic bottom-up modernizing processes, you still had the enclosure acts whereby peasants were basically like wealthy landowners were given a more extensive formalized property right over all of their land. Peasants were kicked off forcibly, like they lost their sort of hereditary claims to land and then were forced to move to cities and work in factories. And you see this in Europe, and then it kind of happened more slowly there. But then like places like Russia, like I think the Soviet Union's real legacy was being like a sort of forceful modernizer, was taking peasantry and turning them into proletariat. Similarly in China, like there's an inevitability that this early process of like kind of going from agrarian to like industrialized society is going to be somewhat authoritarian. And then whether it stays that way or not, I think is like a big open question right now. And but yeah, but I do think like in general as to whether or not like there's some imminent collapse or whether or not that model has is viable, I really don't know. I think China is such a black box to people, and I'm like always interested in more information. I have some old books sitting upstairs to
and somebody I'd also recommend is Michael Pettis. You know who Michael Pettis is? So Michael Pettis used to work for the Carnegie Endowment. He is currently like a professor of economics at I think Peking University. And what's fascinating about him is he's like an extreme critic of the current situation in China. He is it would be of such national security risk for China to either arrest him or deport him that it's like astonishing to me.
He's like this strange exception
where he speaks freely, whatever, and he speaks to their students. And he few things he's written about. One, for example, he's got a great piece about why GDP in China is like literally not the same as it is literally everywhere else.
Interesting. Yeah.
So using GDP as like as an example of Chinese power and economic clout is really you're just kind of giving into their narrative processes versus like actually looking at like it on its face. But he also, one of the things that he talks about is, you talked about shifting people from peasants to proletariat, and then they're facing this middle income gap, or middle income trap, excuse me, which for those who have never heard that phrase, it is the kind of unfortunate thing that occurs with developing countries where they basically get to a point of development somewhere between like 10,000 and 15, maybe 10 and 20,000 US dollars of GDP nominally. And they just can't get past it. They kind of plateau. They usually have a debt crisis and so on. Maybe they hit some demographic wall. China is levered probably greater than almost any other country, maybe with Japan being an exception or something. So except it has a fraction of the GDP per capita. It also, because of the one-child policy, has this demographic issue, both in the fact that they self-selected for men. So in this kind of child-rearing age, there's a huge mismatch of men to women. But also their working age population is about to collapse. And barring some, some miracle and longevity research, which actually people have talked about this being a huge boon from because they need to solve this problem. But Pettis says, one of the big problems is that there's a huge imbalance in GDP allocated to households. So they're trying to push people from peasants to proletariat, but they're not empowering them with a consumption capacity to do it.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely been the sort of currency exchange or kind of monetary strategy that they've had, has basically been continuing to keep the yuan weak domestically, such that they can kind of keep people's wages low and kind of remain like a sort of dominant exporter. And then, having this offshore yuan that is more kind of like is stronger and they want to attract people to use it for trade internationally. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely I think there could easily, I think the view that China's like invincible or something is wrong.
Sure.
Like and it's sort of, I think is more a product of like pessimism here than it is like strength there.
Yeah,
but then
because they're very insecure people.
Yeah, there's that, but I think on the other hand though, it's like you've got like a very like old powerful culture that like is this ginormous common market.
Yeah.
And like a lot of like heft in the international arena is just like, are you a large common market, you know? And so a place like the US like just benefit from being a ginormous common market. Right. And if you can administer it decently, you're gonna have some clout. I don't see a world where they're like irrelevant.
Sure.
But yeah, but the thing, I could say they could become like the world leading power. But even that being said, I still don't think they present like I don't think they're a model for the U.S. Like,
or for like any other. I also don't think it's like people have been very worried, right, that they're going to attract like other developing countries. Mm-hmm. It doesn't even seem like it seems like they're also so terrible at soft power. So for example, right, like beginning of coronavirus, they were like kicking out all these Nigerians from like their housing. Nigeria is a country of the future. It's a country that will be, probably one of the largest countries in the world in 2030, 2050, and so on. Mm-hmm. And now they have this really bad blood. And then you have like Black Lives Matter, for example, where actually, interestingly, it does actually represent a big tool, for example, in not a tool, but like it shows, right, like it kind of instigated a whole bunch of, anti-police brutality things in Nigeria, a far more positive development, and is received by the populace of Nigeria in a far better way. It's just to show you, right? And people always said, I don't know who it is, it could be Kissinger, but I don't think it is, who said that, the Cold War was not won with, nuclear weapons and, strategic containment. It was won with coke and movies and jeans, movies and so on.
Yeah, no, I think there is, it's one of those kind of giant mysterious factors that's like really hard to engineer from the top. But yeah, American soft power is like really formidable. And I remember too, it's like, there's a really good book called Post-War by Tony Judt that is about kind of like just Europe in the post-war period and, vying, the Soviets and Americans vying for dominance. And the area where America just had this like clear leg up is like American cinema comes in and people just really want to watch it. And the Soviets have like absolutely nothing on that level. And and it's just like American cultural production is just like a ridiculously potent force. And so far you just haven't really seen any rivals to it, but it'll be interesting to see if it crops up, but it doesn't appear as though it is. Yeah.
All right. I'll end by asking you first, is there anything that you wanted to cover that we didn't kind of cover? Is there something important that we should have talked about?
No, I think it's good.
Okay, great. So I'll ask the final question, which I've now kind of started, asking people at the end of these podcasts. So I started Grab the Reins basically because what I had identified in kind of millennials and Gen Z is that there was an enormous sense of learned helplessness, right? And I wanted to showcase people who are high agency actors. So congratulations, you're one of those people.
Nice.
And showcase them as an example of how like they could become, a high agency actor themselves. And, this is like, these are the areas that people are exploring who are high agency and that are potent and like could use, minds and bodies, right? Is there anything that you would recommend to people in terms of like how could they grab the reins? Because that's also right, like that's kind of the reason for the name of the podcast.
Yeah, it's a good question.
And whether that also could just be right, like this is how like my path, right? And if that's fine too.
Yeah, I'm definitely. I'll say something about my path, and I think like I'm pretty wary of advice, just in that like everyone, like without knowing someone, advice can be so dangerous because it could be like precisely the wrong thing that they need to hear.
Right.
But I can say for myself, I mean, I think I've just always been really curious about kind of like just sort of like realm of like ideas, history, philosophy, and I've like just imbibed a lot of that. And then it kind of like the great thing about books is they take you outside of the current frame. They're so cheap to produce. It's really just like a skin in the game experiment. It's like, can you be bothered to sit in place and write a book? Like that's the test. Do you care about this enough to write a book? But the costs of doing it are very low. And so there's all this stuff lying around that like really can get you outside of the current frame, and sort of books themselves are like embolden people to think for themselves, I think, because that is, books are just thought kind of manifested. And I think like there's a lot, something that I kind of worry that's being lost, that I think like good people would, should maintain, I think, and it worked for me, is like there's like a sort of like script or book based culture that is not like the flashiest thing, but if you spend enough time reading, like you're just basically reading people who have thought for themselves. And so you can maybe try to take some of that in, but yeah, basically I think like not being too I tried to not be too beholden to any like ideology, tried to read deeply, and then finding like an exciting frontier. Like if you're looking for a place where you can kind of make a name for yourself and kind of live with some autonomy, like finding the frontier is just always a good thing, and that could be anything. That could be like a cultural frontier in music, or like crypto is one in tech and finance. But if you find a frontier, you'll probably find other people who want to try to live for themselves, and you can go there, and even if you play some modest role in it, it'll be like really enjoyable, and will force you to kind of like survive, build for yourself a little bit, and like kind of it will call out the best in you. So I think if there's nothing wrong with not doing that, but if you're someone who's like inclined to try to like forge their own path a little bit, and like it doesn't feel too satisfied with what's on the menu, I think going to a frontier and reading are two things that are good.
Charlie, thank you so much. I know that you're going to be continuing to build out that post-humanist frame, so whenever you release that next thing and you want to chat, you're more than welcome to come back, and I'd love to carry the conversation forward. All right, well, everyone, that's it. Thank you so much for grabbing the reins, and we'll see you next time.